His speech is not good.
I'm sorry.
But in himself, he feels fine, he said.
Okay, we are streaming live now. So first of all, as we're streaming live, Jonathan, do you want to repeat all of those lovely things you said about me? You know, just sat there recorded. For,
yeah. I thought your email of this morning was fabulous.
You didn't have to thank our speaker, but thank you very, very much.
Caring and loving.
As you know, but I've had apologies from David and from Ala and from Ralph.
Oh.
But it is being recorded. We can go ahead. It's up to you. It doesn't bother me.
Would it mean repeating it for those people at some time or not?
No, because it's recorded. It's live. It's going out on Facebook.
Recorded, yeah.
They can go back and listen to it again. It's up to you. We've got to divide the 18th century up into at least two. I'm hoping just two, because we've got the knock-on from the Shabtai Tzvi affair, which we learned about last week, and there's a number of rabbis that are getting involved. And then the end of the century, of course, we have the start of the birth of the Baal Shem Tov, the start of Hasidus, and everything that entailed between the Baal Shem Tov, the Vilna Gaon, the Misnagdim, and the Hasidim.
This is the late 1600s, is it, or 1700s?
Late 1700s.
1700s.
Late 1700s.
18th century, right?
We're in the 18th century. In the 1600s was what we did last week. We had with Shabtai Tzvi and Spinoza at the end of that last week.
Yeah.
This week, this century, the very beginning of it, we've got a lot of rabbis that we're going to be dealing with. And in the middle, we've got the the very short, unfortunate affair of the Frankists, all of whom apostatized, so we'll leave them alone. We then, towards the middle, have Moses Mendelssohn and the beginning of Haskalah, the beginning of the Enlightenment, or Reform, as to give it its better name. But also, the main part of the second half of the century is, well, not the second half, really, the last third, is the birth of the Baal Shem Tov, the beginning of Hasidism and the Vilna Gaon. But that will definitely be for another time. This week, if we do go ahead, we've got Rabbi Yonason Eibishitz, and Rabbi Yehuda, the Chacham Tzvi, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the Shagas Aryeh, a number of influential. When I say influential, I mean one of them gave the eulogy. Wait a second, let's make sure we get the right name, the right eulogy that was given over here. Was it Rabbi Cheskel Landau? No, not Rabbi Cheskel Landau. Was it Rabbi Cheskel Landau? If we put him on twice. Let's move over here. So, yeah, it was Rabbi Cheskel Landau who gave the eulogy. Here, let's get the right one. Where have I lost it? Yes, it wasn't Rabbi. Well done, Sivit got the right person there. Yes.
I picked up because when we went to the thing with the survivor, then he said the story about him. He said.
Okay, all right, yes, well done, Chai Racham. And Rachel Sivirin, sorry, I do apologize. Who gave the eulogy for one of them? We've lost him over here. There was one of them who actually gave the eulogy for the Empress who passed away at that time, and it was translated because they all wanted to know exactly what it was who said that. But so there are a number of quite famous rabbis and events that would take place in the 1700s. So the question is, do we go ahead with doing it now, or do we pick it up next week when everybody else can join in?
What would you prefer? I'm happy either way. It doesn't bother me particularly.
Jonathan?
I myself personally would like to go ahead.
Yeah.
Now.
Radio. Jonathan wants it personally, and that is what we're going to do.
Fine, lovely.
Brilliant.
Can I ask a question just before you start, Rabbi?
You can do, yes.
Was Spinoza buried as a Jew? Do you know?
That's a question and a half.
Yes, Spinoza was definitely buried as a Jew. Spinoza, yes, he was definitely buried as a Jew. And he doesn't even know. He stays Jewish. But
yeah.
Spinoza stays Jewish. He doesn't apostatize. You've got others who apostatize. Spinoza did not apostatize.
Right.
Frankist.
Where was he buried? Was it in Amsterdam, or did he move from there eventually?
I believe in Amsterdam. Let's see if we've got it written down in my book here.
Why are you asking, Alan? Are you thinking of going along?
No, no, purely out of interest. No,
Yeah.
no other reason.
Right.
We should go one day. Get a day trip with EasyJet.
Can't go anywhere at the moment.
I know, one day.
Yeah.
If we live that long.
Yeah.
Right. Let's see if it's got here.
Don't worry if you can't get it straight away.
No, it's right over here. His treatise here is 1661. There is over there. Somebody's had a bit of a beep beep. Doesn't actually say.
No, okay.
No.
I can live with it for the time being.
Yeah. No, but he was definitely buried as a Jew. Well, we'll do a little bit of research later on, and we'll try and come up with it.
Okay.
Right. Leave back here so I can see you once again. So last week we learnt of the terrible incident, the Shabtai Tzvi, who declared himself as being the Mashiach, he's originally from Turkey, takes along a lot of European Jewry, ends up eventually apostatizing, becoming Mehmed Effendi Pisha in March 1666, and he gives up everything. Well, he just proved himself to be a total fraud with a schizophrenic. In fact, Shabtai Tzvi's problem, he began his life, as we learned last week, he was a Kabbalist, and that will play over into this century because he gets caught up with everything. His real issue, as we learned last week, wasn't necessarily with him. It was the fact that you had Nathan of Gaza, who manipulated everything. I am not in any way, shape, or form exonerating or excusing what Shabtai Tzvi did, but he was an unwell character who got caught up with everything. And
There are still people who he still has a following. I understand in Turkey, in Istanbul.
To say he has a following it's technically speaking correct. There are still those who believe in Shabtai Tzvi, but whether they still believe in him or they believe that he was badly done to, and he was murdered and he was dropped by the community. If only we would have listened to him, then Hashem would have decided at the time. You'll find it hard pressed to find those who admit or who even are Shabbatians.
Right.
But in the beginning of the 18th century, where we are now, you've got one Rav by the name of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, born in 1697, passes away in 1776. And he, because of his father, he becomes quite a zealot. I knew the word in Hebrew, not English. He becomes a zealot against anybody who he fears is a Shabbatian. He picked this up from his father. It was a family business. His father's a Chacham Tzvi. Remember, in those days, people did not have surnames, so it changes on. I'm just going to move this screen just for a second. I'm going to move it one place, and that it should be then easier for me to deal with it. Turn to the left of the screen. Yeah, we've got that there. Well done. And then we're going to open this one up over here. I should be able to have them side by side and make it a little bit easier for me. To the right of the screen. That there and that there. There we go. Got it. Brilliant. I've now managed to get my notes on the same screen, so we can work along a little bit easier. So we got Reb Yaakov, the Chacham Tzvi, Reb Yaakov Emden's father, born in 1658, passes away in 1718. He is called the Chacham Tzvi, Rabbi Tzvi Ashkenazi, because he was the main rabbi of various Germanic Ashkenazi communities, although the Chacham Tzvi is the same as rabbi because he was also a Rav of the Sephardi communities. That shows you the greatness of the man, that he was able to have both the Ashkenazim and the Sephardi communities both revere him. He was an extremely extremely learned and clever man. He was a young child. He moved along to out often, a district in the city of
Germany, Austria.
Budapest, where his mother's family lived. His father, his grandfather were his main teachers. And at one point, they send him to Salonika in Greece, where he joins a famous yeshiva there. And he becomes an authority on halacha and on Talmud. And it's only 18 where the city of the Council of Constantinople gives him the name of Chacham. So we see how he's Germanic. He moves along to Budapest. He gets taught in Salonika. He gets Semicha, Chacham, in Constantinople. So he's definitely an amazing. The Chacham Tzvi, you quote a halacha from him, you know what you're doing with. He goes back to his father's house in Budapest, but unfortunately, the Austrian war against the Turks at that point, Budapest is besieged. It's heavily defended. A cannonball hits his house and kills, unfortunately, his wife and his only daughter. So he's a young man. His wife and his only daughter passed away. He just about manages to escape. He comes to Sarajevo. This is well before the Bosnian War. And at that point, Sarajevo, it's a good place for him to go to, although once again, he gets caught up. But it's at this point here, and why it's important for us. Please stop that. Please put it to the side. No, put it aside. Stop. Yeah, and leave it. Leave it down. Thank you. At this point here, when he's in Southeast Europe, he hears and he gets caught up with this Shabtai Tzvi moment. Even though by that point Shabtai Tzvi was dead and he betrayed everything by becoming a Muslim, nevertheless, he knows about them, and he also learns of a dangerous imposter by the name of Nehemiah Chiyun, who years later, 25 years later, caused a lot of problem to the Chacham Tzvi. He doesn't stay in Sarajevo long. He gets caught up in the Austro-Hungarian, Austro-Turkish war. He flees a second time. He goes to Italy, stays in Mantua and Venice. Then he crosses along until eventually he comes along to Berlin. Wherever he goes, his fame goes in front of him. When he's in Berlin, he remarries again. This time is a daughter of Rabbi Meshulam Zalman Neumark, who's the head of three communities. We learned, if we go back to the 12th, 11th century, when we're reading of the destruction of the cities of Shum, Spears, Vimes, Worms, and Mainz. So communities often gather together and they've got an acronym. This one is called AHU because it is Altona, Hansberg, and Wandsbek. Three communities join together, and he marries a daughter of the head of the communities. And he gets invited to be head of the rabbinate of the Ashkenazi communities, and his wife tells him to do it. He does not want to do it, but his wife convinces him to do it. But the Chacham Tzvi is never, ever going to bow down to any pressure. And at one point, they brought along another rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Rothenberg, who in the best of times wouldn't have been a great Rav, but compared to the Chacham Tzvi, was totally inferior. So the Chacham Tzvi says, fine, I'm not going to get an argument with you. He moves along to his own little shul. He resigns from the position of the Ashkenazi communities. He gets a quiet little place there, and he has his own one. He then moves to Amsterdam because the rabbis in Amsterdam call him out. He moves along to Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, he finds a very flourishing community, but because he's so strong at it, they often fight with him. Amsterdam, the community, unfortunately, respected wealth more than they did wisdom. And if you sat on the Eastern Wall, it's because you had the money, not because you were necessarily the learned. And the Chacham Tzvi respected wisdom, integrity, orthodoxy is the wrong word because orthodoxy, but religious. And an honest, upright person, regardless of the wealth that they had. And at the end of the day, he falls into a bit of a trap, or he gets caught up when Nehemiah Chion comes along. The Chacham Tzvi had met him already in Sarajevo about 25 years earlier. He knows that he is a follower of the Chacham Tzvi, and he's already been Shabtai Tzvi, thank you very much. The Chacham Tzvi knows that this Nehemiah Chion is a follower of Shabtai Tzvi. He has written a number of treatises. He kept them anonymous because in Jerusalem he gets put into Cherem, he gets put into a ban. So he flees from there and he comes to Amsterdam. Unfortunately for him, one of the rabbis who had banned him in Jerusalem was Rabbi Moshe Chagiz, who had just moved from Jerusalem to Amsterdam. So he couldn't hide and pretend that it wasn't him. And Rabbi Moshe Chagiz, together with the Chacham Tzvi, in 1710, they put Nehemiah Chion under excommunication. Unfortunately, this argument goes a lot further, and many of the rabbis get involved with this over here. There's the Chacham Tzvi is called to a tribunal, and he refuses to go along because he knows the whole thing is going to be a farce, and there's a massive argument between the Portuguese and the Ashkenazi communities in Amsterdam. The Portuguese ones are following, and the Portuguese are following the Nehemiah Chion. They are agreeing that he is correct. He's not an imposter, and the Ashkenazi ones are following the Chacham Tzvi. Meanwhile, new evidence comes to light and proves it. Unfortunately, this gets sent together to the non-Jewish authorities, and they actually find against the Chacham Tzvi. Although the Chacham Tzvi doesn't stay there, he goes to Emden, which is where his son, who we're going to look at a bit more, gets his name, Rabbi Yaakov Emden. But whilst he's in Emden, he gets a call to join the Sephardic community where is the Chacham Tzvi invited to become the rabbi of?
Istanbul.
Not this country, is it?
London.
London, yeah.
He gets invited to join the Bevis Mark Shul, the Sephardic community in London. A number of years earlier, they had consulted with the Chacham Tzvi about the case of Rabbi David Nieto, who had been accused of preaching against things which are contrary to the Torah. Chacham Tzvi proved that he'd been misunderstood, and so when the position of the chief rabbi was vacant, they offered it to the Chacham Tzvi. He came to London, he was received with great honor, but he decides not to do it, and he goes back to Europe, and eventually he becomes the chief rabbi of Lemberg. And that is, he stays there for only 4 months. Unfortunately, he passed away. But his son, so that's just a little bit of a background, how he carries on it's a family job. Rabbi Yaakov Emden picks up on what it is that his father started. And unfortunately, not once, but twice, he picked a fight is the wrong one. He accused, or he saw in two of his colleagues the possibility, the fact that they were Shabbatians. The first one he does with is a man by the name of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. And it's a little bit upset now that Raf is not able to join us, because Raf has learned that the Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto is called the Ramchal, and the Ramchal writes a number of Sefarim. Two of them Raf has learned. One of them is the Mesilas Yesharim, the path of the just, and the Derech Hashem, the way to Hashem. The Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was born in 1707 in a city called Padua in the Republic of Venice in Italy. He passes away in Tveria. He passes away, though he's only 39 years old. And his story is tragic. But what he accomplished during that time is phenomenal, because already by the age of 20, he was known to be a Kabbalist. Now, everyone, including Rabbi Yaakov Emden, agreed there's nothing wrong with learning Kabbalah. The word Kabbalah means it's accepted. It's come from Sinai. It's an authentic part of Judaism. There's nothing wrong with Kabbalah in and of itself. There's nothing wrong with using Kabbalah. However, the imposters of Shabtai Tzvi and others had been Kabbalists as well. And so therefore, anybody that learned Kabbalah at that point got tainted with the same brush. Not because there's anything wrong with Kabbalah, but because you must be that sort of person in order to be able to learn it. Okay. Homeschooling is beautiful, but I've got a fiddler on my hands who loves fiddling around. No, she's fine. She's been given some soup where she's got a spoon in her hand. She won't be able to fiddle with the pink tap that she was. And it's and it's important to stress that nothing wrong. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden and his father Chacham Tzvi, together with his colleague Moshe Chagis, all agree there's nothing wrong with Kabbalah. But there'd been an understanding that Kabbalah was learned once you hit the age of 40. The Ramchal passed away and he was 39. And that it wasn't learned by the unmarried. By the time he was 20, the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, was already very well versed with Kabbalah and was a prolific author. He was a pathfinder, he was a pioneer. Anything that comes along later on, he was sort of the first one to have plowed that field. He was a phenomenal person. They say, and it gets, the fact that it gets repeated time and time again does not necessarily prove it to be true. But they say that the Vilna Gaon, who was only 20 years younger than the Ramchal, but he only gets hold of his Sefer, Mesilas Yesharim, after he passed away. He writes it in 1740. The Ramchal passed away in 1746. The Vilna Gaon gets hold of this after the death of the Ramchal, and is reported to have said that had he received this during the lifetime of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, the author of it, he would have walked by foot in order to go and sit by his feet and learn. He said after reading the first 10 chapters, there's not one superfluous word within it. However, the area that he was working in made him a prime target, but he never backed down. He was also a brilliant poet. His knowledge of Hebrew and of grammar, he writes at one point the equivalent of Tehillim, 150 hymns, that they are based on Tehillim. We only know of 2 that definitely survived from there. There's another 7 that were recited elsewhere that might have come from him, but most probably weren't. But Rabbi Yaakov Emden doesn't pick a fight with him, but he calls him to task. Yes, Chai?
What do you mean survived? What happened to the others?
Don't know. What happened to the others? Yeah. So there weren't many copies of them, so nobody knows where they are. But, if reference is made to them, so we know that these things do exist. Now, his brilliance is that he threw off the shackles of medieval Hebrew writing. A number of weeks ago, we looked at the poets and the poetry of the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. Some of it beautiful and flowery, but not samzach. It didn't get to the point. The Ramchal writes in a manner that is reminiscent of Rambam, reminiscent of the Mishnah. Short, precise, to the point. There's nothing superfluous there. He knows about rhetoric. He knows about putting the argument forward without having to be verbose, without having to fill the page with superfluous words just so that it looks like. Alan, I'm sure, and Jonathan, maybe you as well, I'm sure in your professional career, you've come across once or twice a legal document drawn up by a layman who feels, and it's filled, whereas the parties contained within, because you think that you've got to write more in order. Brevity is,
Hereinafter call the party the first part.
Yes, yeah. You don't need any of that, but that's a layman trying to write, a legal document. The Ramchal proved how he did it wasn't necessary, and he would write everything there properly and specifically. He gets, let's just get through the now, his real problem started in 1729. By this point, he is only 22 years old. A disciple of his, Rabbi Yekusiel Gordon of Vilna, he published a letter saying that the Ramchal had communicated with somebody called a Maggid. Now, this was not unheard of. We have Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, writes in a diary of his visits from the Maggid. He writes a whole book on what the Maggid, the preacher, told him, which was always used by those who described getting heavenly vision, which were not unheard of, and many of some great scholars, Kabbalists, had them. They in and of themselves were not wrong, but the problem was that this came straight after Shabtai Tzvi. And Moshe Chagiz, who was the partner with the Chacham Tzvi, the father of Reb Yaakov Emden, the Rav at this point, demanded that he be condemned. Not excommunicated, he had to be condemned. The rabbis of Padua forced him to give up some of his Kabbalistic activities. If you're not in Israel, you can get away with it. Go up to Safas, go up to the northeast of Israel, to Tveria and Safas, you can get away with a lot more. Outside of Israel, they didn't like it as much because once bitten, twice shies. But he continued to write Kabbalistic works for his own personal use. Unfortunately, he gets found out, and by 1734, his books are banned by the rabbis of Italy. He's born in 1707. By 1734, so he is at this point 27 years old, his books have been banned. A colleague of mine, when his first book was banned, he says, I finally made it. I've got, having a book banned, you've done it once the book is banned. Then if nobody bans your book, then you haven't upset anybody. You really want to be able to, write whatever you want. But if you're a great person, if I wrote something like that, nobody would care. But once the Ramchal does it, it was different. He gets banned. He goes along, he gets humiliated by the rabbis in Frankfurt am Main. He's forced to take an oath that he would end any further study and practice of Kabbalah. He moves to Amsterdam, where he becomes an optical lens grinder and a diamond polisher. He has not yet written his famous book. He's already been he's been banned from writing publicly. He writes for himself, they find out he gets condemned by his hometown. Frankfurt am Main condemning. His books get banned and not allowed to be used. He goes along to Amsterdam, and it's whilst he's in Amsterdam that he writes the book Mesilas Yesharim, The Path of the Just. This becomes the proof text of the whole Mussar movement 150 years later. Without Mesilas Yesharim, the whole concept of Mussar probably wouldn't be around. Or if it would, it would have a very different flavor. This is what he writes after he gets banned. In 1743, he goes along to Eretz Yisrael. He settles in Tveria, and unfortunately, by 1746, within 3 years, him and his wife and his family are caught up with an epidemic of the plague that swept through the city of Tveria, and he passes away. Rabbi Yaakov Emden later on says how he was glad that he did not sign the letter of condemnation written by Moshe Chagiz, and he says, you know what, I recant. If his only sin was in revealing secrets told him by the heavenly voice, then may my share be like his share. The fact that he was younger, not yet married whilst he was learning Kabbalah, is a slight transgression. He says, shouldn't have done it, but he accomplished a lot. And the Ramchal, we don't know what would have happened had he not been ostracized, had he not been forced to leave to Tveria. Presumably he wouldn't have died, he wouldn't have caught the plague, but a person's life is the person's life where they are anyway. And so, but in that time, he does manage to write a number of highly influential Sephorim, and we have to give thanks to it. But the other argument that Rabbi Yaakov Emden had over Shabtai Tzvi was with Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz. Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz, born in 1690, passes away in 1764. And Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz causes him a lot more problems. He's born in Krakow, in Poland, in 1690. His father was the Rav in Eibeshitz. That's where he gets the name Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz. He dies when Yonason is a young man. He is an orphan, and he gets brought up by a wealthy Jew in Vienna. And at one point, he gets taken back to Proznitz. He lives there, and he learns there. His mother passes away quite soon afterwards, and he becomes a foster child with Rabbi Yitzchok Shapiro, the chief rabbi of Prague. And when he becomes a marriageable age, who does he marry? The rabbi's daughter. So he was unfortunately a double orphan. His father, his mother, he gets brought up by the chief rabbi, and he marries the chief rabbi's daughter. So, but he lives in his father-in-law's house. He becomes known again as a brilliant scholar. And again, already at the age of 18, he's invited to be the Rav in Jungbunzlau in Czechoslovakia. Don't ask me where that is, but he becomes a Rav in Czechoslovakia. 3 years later, he comes back to Prague to head the yeshiva there, and he becomes a very, very famous scholar. He sets up a number of yeshivas, and he's known by anything. However, again, he gets caught up in a number of wars. In 1741, he's the rabbi of Metz, and there is the war between Prussia and Austria at this point. The French army, in support of Prussia, invades Bohemia. Reb Yonason finds favor with the French, and they offer him safe passage to Metz. And in 1742, he leaves Prague with all of his family. He goes along to Metz, although they've got to leave everything behind. When the French withdrew from Prague and Bohemia, the Austrian government reestablished there. They decided that Rabbi Yonason's getting the French to escort him out of the city, basically colluded with them, was treacherous, and he was not allowed to ever return back to Prague. Now, he was a Rav there for 9 years, and then he goes along in 1750 to the community we mentioned before, Ahoy, Altmeid, Hamburg, and Wandsbek. And it's there that he starts to get into a bit of trouble. That first year that he's a Rav in Ahoy, there was a sudden rise of deaths in childbirth. Now, Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz was known as being a bit of a Kabbalist, and a number of them came to him for help. We've had the answers written in the Gemara. If you have a kemia, an amulet, so much so we had in the Gemara, it told us that if you've had an amulet that's worked 3 times, or somebody that's written 3 different amulets that's worked, you're allowed to carry them on Shabbos. The mission is to carry them in public. It's not an item of clothing, but you can carry from a private domain to a public domain an amulet on Shabbos if it's proven to be. Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz had a reputation of writing amulets. Now, this is not the time to discuss how amulets work, whether it is psychosymptomatic, whether it's using a
forbidden force.
No, definitely not. It's definitely kosher. Does it use Kabbalah? Does it use real? Or is it something that, it makes you feel, trach gut wird sein gut. If you have a positive attitude, it might, sometimes it can be self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm not well, in Spike Milligan, told you I wasn't feeling well, or the opposite also happens. If you know it's going to be all right, then you know it's going to be all right. He wrote a number of amulets, kemia, to be worn by the expectant mothers, as it used to do. One of those, whether it was officially written by him or because he was writing amulets, therefore they then thought any amulet around was written by him. We've had it, Alan, recently in the Gemara, any animal found in Jerusalem around the time of the foot festivals is automatically deemed to be consecrated, because that's what animals would be there for. So any amulets that were found at this time must have been written by him. And one of them, supposedly written by him, was brought to Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who is the Rav in Altona at that point. And he looks at this and he finds within this amulet, which the amulet was a number of letters. It's basically, it looks like a chessboard, I think but it's bigger than 8 by 8. And it's written, and it's the same words written over and over and over, plus sometimes in different orders. And you can read them over and over. I mean, we have very similar, on the back of a mezuzah, we write, letters are written in order that would reflect when backwards, read it the other way around, Shema Yisrael. You've got similar, so it's not hocus pocus, it has a long-standing tradition. Rabbi Yonasan Eibishter has written a number of them. One of them that either he wrote or which was attributed to him was given to Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov finds within this an allusion, hidden allusions to Shabtai Tzvi. And he calls him out as being a follower of Shabtai Tzvi, which at that point in time, totally forbidden. You can't have that done. I'm trying to think the equivalent of it nowadays. There isn't one, okay. When Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory, when he wrote, he was accused of being a sympathizer of Hugo Grin. Totally strike him off the board. He wasn't. No. Hugo Grin was a rabbi of the Reform community, passed away 30 or so years ago, and Chief Rabbi wrote something about him. So, but that is the only. But here you've got a community which was very tightly knit, and Shabtai Tzvi was terrible. So the leaders of the community went to the defense of Rabbi Yonasan Eibishter. They proclaimed the boycott of Rabbi Emden's shul. They told him that he has to leave town within 6 months. But this spread everywhere, and every community was split in two, or every community took a side. You were either following Rabbi Yaakov Emden, or you were following Rabbi Yonasan Eibishter. You couldn't sit on the fence. In recent years, last year, there became the concept that you're either a racist or anti-racist. You can't be sitting on the fence. You've got to be vocally anti-racist, otherwise you are racist. Sorry, can't take the phone call at the moment. Otherwise you are, so there you had to have a position of either being following Rabbi Yaakov Emden or following Rabbi Yonasan Eibishter. Unfortunately, Rabbi Yonasan Eibishter actually brought his case to the Council of Four Lands. We learned about it previously. The Vad Arba Harotzes. They convened in Jaroslav specifically for this purpose in 1753. His innocence was absolutely established, and the dispute really calmed down. And Rabbi Yonasan Eibishter was confirmed in office by the Hamburg Senate in Kislev 1757, and wasn't troubled by this ever again. But even till today, I was doing a little bit of research on this, and on one of the articles I said, so there's underneath it, there's comments. Someone says, you never mentioned Shabbatir. I'm a grandson of Rabbi Yonasan Eibishter, and it never happened. Still today, there's still the lines were drawn in the sand. One of those who wrote a letter trying to bring everything back together is Rabbi Cheskel Landau, known as the Noida B'Yehuda. We've actually learned about him once before. This is one of the books he wrote, the Noida B'Yehuda, which is a collection of questions of how, and we've learned one of them before, which was Reish Yud. Let's get that right. On about doing a post-mortem. If you've got two people in front of you, one's died from this disease, the other one hasn't, he gave permission to do a post-mortem, which was forbidden, in order to learn how to rescue the other. But other than that, he forbade it. That's Rabbi Cheskel Landau. He's born in 1713, passes away in 1793. So he lived till the age of 80. And he's a Rav of Prague for 38 years. He was a phenomenal scholar. His writings, we've got some of them. That one about the thing was written to London? Was it this one? We have one of them where he wrote to the community in, no, this one wasn't to London. Yes, McKinney to London. This was the fact of doing the autopsy was sent to him by the Besht Din of London. They sent the question over to him, to Rabbi Cheskel Landau in Prague. He's born in Optua, a small town in Poland. His father was Rabbi Yehuda ben Tzvi Siegel Landau, who was the Levi. When we went to Poland last time round, we took with us Dov Landau, who'd been, he's a descendant of the famous Rabbi Cheskel Landau. There's not many of them, and there was a guy, a family friend of ours, lives in North Manchester, said, yeah, part of the same family of this Landau of Levium. He was a wealthy man, and he was the lifelong president of the Optua community and the deputy of the Council of Four Lands. So as a young boy, Yecheskel, he gets involved in the problems of Jewish community life. He saw, and here you've got the importance of knowing how a community works. He wasn't just a man whose head was in the books, but he knew the ins and outs of the community. His father was the president of the community, the deputy of the Council of the Four Lands, which covered all of them. He, even before his bar mitzvah, he's recognized by everyone as being, again, a scholar. At the age of 14, he goes along to Brody, a city of Brody, which was known as the center of Jewish learning of those days. And at the age of 18, he gets married to the daughter of a prominent Jew, Yekelko of Dubna. Stays with his father-in-law, but he goes along. He convinces his father-in-law to move along to Brody. At the age of 20, in 1734, 21 actually, he becomes the head of the Besht Din of Brody. That's a crazy honor to be given to a young person. He distinguishes himself as a dayan. He holds that for 11 years. And during that time is when a lot of the questions come to him, and that's why he's able to write the Noid Yehuda. But he, in 1745, he's asked, he goes along to Yampol, and that's when he's asked to write a letter or to give his view on the controversy between Rabbi Yaakov Emden and Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz over Shabbatina. And he writes them all down, and he says that, listen, you've got to understand that both of them mean l'shem shamayim. He's able to say, look, everyone, they have integrity here. And eventually, let me get the right one. When he passes away, was it over here? When Rabbi Yaakov Emden passes away in 1776, he passed away, it was a Friday afternoon, and he's buried in the city of Hamburg, just within a couple of hours. It's before Shabbos. Because it was such a rush, there was for some reason an open grave, and they said, "Oh, you know what? Let's bury him here." Normally, you wouldn't, but why that grave would have been open? You're not allowed to dig a grave in advance. But for some reason, they get to the cemetery. There's an open grave there. They bury him in it, and it turns out that it's just a couple of spaces on from his long time antagonist, Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz. Now, according to some, that actually this wasn't coincidence, but it happened. It had been ruled upon by Rabbi Cheskel Landau, who said that before he passes away, Rabbi Yaakov Emden had welcomed the vision of Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz, who died in 12 years before, in 1764. This was in 1776. He gets the vision of it, and Rabbi Cheskel said that actually he dafka should be buried on the same row to show that they didn't have an argument, because we have a concept already from the 12th century of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid that enemies should not be buried on the same row. But Rabbi Cheskel Landau said these two were not enemies. They were fighting an argument for the sake of heaven. And he said, had they been left alone, it would have just been two guys arguing, lots up. But communities got involved. And that's why it spread. Had it just been two rabbis arguing, it would have been enough. But Rabbi Cheskel Landau, he's the one that draws a line underneath it. I say you still have those say, oh, I'm from this one, I'm from that one. But Rabbi Cheskel Landau is very much to say that we've got to understand that here is people who are arguing for the sake of heaven. Then they weren't, when Rabbi Yaakov Emden accused Rabbi Yonasan Eibishitz of being of Shabbatin, it wasn't because it wasn't an argument ad hominem. He wasn't going against the man. It was the fact that, this is dangerous. If he turns out to be Shabbatin, then all of his rulings and all the food that he's put his hechsher on, everything is tainted by it. And he believed at the end, we know that Rabbi Yaakov Emden after said that the Ramchal was correct. And according to Rabbi Landau, he also agreed that Rabbi Yonasan Eibishitz was correct. So we're going to leave him alone for the moment. He passes away in 1793 at the age of 80. He'd been the Rav of Prague for 38 years. But there are just two more that I want us to look at the moment before we do finish. One of them is the Shagas Aryeh. The Shagas Aryeh, unfortunately, we should have read it there last week because he's born in 1695 and he's a Rav until 1785. He passes away at the age of 90, which is quite phenomenal in those days. And I first heard the story about, my first recollection of hearing the last part of his story was when I was in a trip with Chief Rabbi Mervis when we went to Europe, when we went along to Frankfurt, went to Worms, and he told us the story here of I'll leave it. Just the end story I heard there. So Reb Aryeh Leib, Ben Reb Osher, is known as the Shagas Aryeh, which means the roar of the lion. He's a famous scholar. However, at the height of his fame, just when he's published this important Talmudic work, the Shagas Aryeh, he decides that's it. Ganuk is Ganuk. I'm giving up my rabbinic post, and he's going to wander along. His wife said she's going with him, and he tried to convince her, don't be silly. You don't need to wander with me. I'll come back around from time to time. He's 56, 57 at this time. He's in his late 50s. And he says, so don't worry, I'll come back around. And she says, no, I'm going with you. So the wanderlust, they go along. At that time, most Jewish communities had a public shelter. You're poor, you're homeless, you go along, you sit in that shelter a few days, however long you want. But the Shagas Aryeh, Rabbi Aryeh Leib and his wife, did not want anybody to know who they were. They would go along. He would go to town. He would go into the shul. He would sit studying quietly. The wife would earn a few coppers by doing some housework. And then by the time she would come back in the evening, she would have had some supper ready for him. Sorry, just going to move there. And they would carry on. Now, at that time, in Frankfurt in Germany, there was Reb Nosson HaKohen Adlam, who I believe is Reb Nosson, who becomes Chief Rabbi of England later on. Now, Reb Nosson was a wealthy man, and he didn't actually want to have a paid rabbinic position, but he has a lot of yeshiva. Somebody's got a lot of noise in the background. Bernice, I think you've got a radio on. I've muted you because you've got a radio on there and it's coming through. My apologies, I'm sorry. And one of his students who we'll learn about in 2 weeks' time, because we won't get to it next week, because we've got Hasidism, is Moshe Sefer, who becomes a famous Chassam Sefer. We'll get to it later, and his argument with the Reform movement and some of the placement of the bimah that we have today is because of him. And it's because of him that Wilburn Road Shul, the part of the argument there about the bimah being right up at the front, that there's no room to walk around it, is based on something that he wrote. And that was why there was some that wouldn't go to Wilburn Road Shul from the Chassam Sefer. But his teacher was Reb Nosson HaKohen Adlam. Now the name Adla means eagle. Shagas Aryeh means, Aryeh is lion. And the two of them do meet up. And Reb Adla knows that the Shagas Aryeh is Reb Aryeh Leib is wandering around. And he wants to meet him, and he knows he go from place to place. So he goes along to the manager of the local homeless shelter. He says, At one point, an elderly couple, refined couple, is going to turn up at the shelter. As soon as you do, come tell me. He says, you'll know who I'm talking about when they turn up. Weeks, months go by and nothing happens. In fact, the manager forgets about it. One night, though, an elderly couple do arrive at the shelter. They're both carrying a bundle on the packs. The guests are already sleeping, but they sit down. The man takes out a candle to light, and the wife takes out some potatoes to bake them in the oven. After they've eaten, the woman goes to sleep, but the husband continues learning. Some of the residents there get annoyed that the noise is disturbing them. The candle is disturbing them. One of them blows out the candle. The man says nothing, takes his book to the window. There's a full moon. He sits down and he continues learning. In the morning, he's learned the whole night long. All of a sudden, this man jumps up for joy. Yes! He'd solved a knotty Talmudical problem. Everybody jumps up. What's going on over there? They're screaming, shouting. The manager says, leave alone. Everyone's welcome in this place. We should make others welcome too. Leave them be. And then all of a sudden he realizes, wait a second. Rabbi Adler asked me to look out for this refined couple. Here's a guy who's been sitting learning the whole night long. And yes, he's caused trouble, but through no fault of his own, he wants to sit and he's learning. You know, he runs along to Rabbi Adler and he tells him. Rabbi Adler turns around to Ramoshe, who won't be the Chasam Sofer. He says, quick, go along. And they go along there together. And Rabbi Adler, confronts this man. He realizes he's been outed. And he agrees, yes, I'm the Shagas Ari, I'm Reb Ariam. And he walked back. Reb Moshe Sefer writes later on that you had Reb Adler, the eagle, Reb Aryeh, Shagas Aryeh, the lion. He said listening to the two of them talk as he went back was the greatest privilege of his life. Now, this bit I love. This is not the story I'm talking about. This bit I love. When Reb Aryeh walks into Rabbi Adler's room and he sees the bookcase behind him, he said with a smile, if I had access to those treasures, I wouldn't need to burden my brain to carry all the books in my head. And he meant it. What do you do in those? Nowadays, you got a phone. You want anything. The amount of times a question comes up on the rabbinic WhatsApp group, someone says, I don't have access to my books, but just a minute. And he Googles it. Yeah, this is it. In those days, you didn't. You had the books. And if you're traveling, you didn't carry one or two books. He carried it all in his head. He stays there for a number of weeks and he convinces, and bear in mind, he's a number of years older than him. Reb Adler convinces the older one to give a number of shiurim. And he says, you know what, it's enough already. Stop wandering around. He says, Reb Adler said, I received an invitation from the community of Metz in France that they want to offer him the position of the chief rabbi. I haven't replied because I didn't really want to take a paid position. I don't want to be a slave to the community. But I'm going to write to them and tell them that they're far better off getting the lion rather than the eagle, Reb Aryeh, rather than Reb Adler, and you would go along. Reb Aryeh agreed. He gets sent along. They receive the recommendation. He gets offered the position and he goes back. When he finally gets to Metz, he is 60 years old. And this was a story that Chief Rabbi Mervis told us when I was with him in Metz. And he gets up the first Shabbos in Shul, and they see an old man. He's 60 years old. He's accomplished everything, and he's been wandering for a couple of years. They see an old man. They wanted a youngster. This was in the days before, when he sent along the resume, there wasn't a picture of him. They couldn't Google him to find out. He didn't have a Wikipedia page to figure out who he was. They see an older man. So he gets there. He's a packed shul. The first Shabbos, the Rov's there, packed shul. He says, I had a feeling that you expected and hoped to engage a younger rabbi. One like my distinguished colleague you sent to, Rabbi Nosson Adler. He's younger. Indeed, the Mishnah tells us that Arba'im 40 is the age of understanding. And you wanted to get such a Rav who come along at 40, has understanding, gives you 30 years, and retires at 70. Now you've got a 60-year-old, you think you're going to have to get another Rav in 10 years? Let me therefore assure you, my good friends, that although I'm 60 years old, I'm confident you'll have no need to look for a replacement for another 30 years. Shagas Aryeh was a Rav in Metz for 30 years, passing away at the age of 90. And when Chief Rabbi Mervis told us the story, he then added in a couple of other points about, he says, don't worry. I mean, I remember hearing from, and it reminded me of what Rabbi Sachs said when Rabbi Sachs became chief rabbi. He was a younger man. So he passed away this year. He was 72. And when he became chief rabbi in 1992, he was born in 1948. So he became chief rabbi in 1992. So how old was he?
44.
44.
Young man to be the chief rabbi. I've still got 2 years to go. I'm only 42.
44. Don't worry.
And he was asked, and I'm not sure whether it was by a journalist, it might have been on Desert Island Disc that he was asked before he took over, but he was asked in between when he was chief rabbi elect, and they saw him and he was a young looking man. And he said to him, you look a bit young to be the chief rabbi. And he says, I have a funny feeling that before long, I will look old enough to be the chief rabbi. The Shagas Arias said something correct. He said, I'll be there. Now, it would have been a lovely place for us to stop. However, I just want to do one last person, because whilst he doesn't fit in with anything we've done now, he passes away in 1700, and that's the century we're doing now. A Rav by the name of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, not to be confused with the other Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, who was from the 11th, 12th century. Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, it depends which what you look at. According to Rabbi Sharma, he was on Shabbos HaGodel of 1700, April. He gets up and he says that he's going to leave for Eretz Yisrael. According to other online research, it happened back in 1697. Then when he leaves for Moravia, stops in Nikolsburg, spends a year traveling through Germany. By the time they get to Italy, they're about 1500, and they're going along to Eretz Yisrael. Bearing in mind, Shabtai Tzvi had been found out in 1656, was it? Shabtai Tzvi was we finally got rid of him? Yeah, 1666, sorry. He found, so in 1700, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid tells it, and a lot of them sell everything they've got. They're going up. Here's a guy, honest. He's not claiming to be Mashiach, but we've got to go to Eretz Yisrael. He gets there. By that point, there are in Jerusalem 200 Ashkenazim and about 1,000 Sephardic Jews. With Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid turning up anywhere between 500 and 1,000. There were 1,500 when they left. A number of them turned back. A number of them, unfortunately, died on the journey. Some ran out of money. Some ran out of steam. But he gets it with anywhere between 500 and 1,000 Jews. It's a crazy crisis. And especially some thought that they were Shabbatins, because why else have we turned up, in Israel all of a sudden? Unfortunately, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid passed away 3 days after arriving in Yerushalayim. He's buried on Har HaZeitim. And they started to build a new shul. They wanted to build a new shul. In 1720, the Arab creditors broke into the shul, set it on fire, and took over the area. That shul you will probably all know well. It is called the Churva, which is the ruins of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. That shul remained in disrepair until the early 20th century. So for 200 years remained in disrepair. It was then rebuilt in the run-up to before 1948. In 1948, it had a beautiful dome on it. And there's a book, Forever My Jerusalem, there's a young girl that describes, it's still named after Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. And it was known as the Churva, the ruins, even though it was a beautiful shul, because he'd started it, been destroyed in 1720, but it gets built in 1948. It is the skyline of Jerusalem. When you're in the center, it's built right underneath it is a shul that's attributed to Nachmanides. Ramban's shul is right there. Ramban wasn't there, but when Ramban gets there in the 1200s, they don't even have a minyan. They don't have a Sefer Torah. He's got to borrow one from Tver in order to make a minyan in Yerushalayim. But now we are in 1700. He starts to build a shul. He dies within 3 days. The Ashkenazi community continue it. The Arabs destroyed it in 1720. It stays as a ruins. The new Yeshuv rebuilt it. I'm not either the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s. In 1948, it is a beautiful shul with a domed roof, with a sky night painted on top of it. It gets destroyed by the Jordanians in 1948, and it stays a total ruin until 1967. when Jerusalem is recaptured in 1967 and it's back in its rightful Jewish hands, it gets cleared out. At some point in the 80s, they rebuild just the archway, and you get there and you can see what it was like. All the way through the 1990s, that was all that was there. In the mid 2000s, and then only recently they've rebuilt it properly. You can go there. They've rebuilt the shul. It's still called the Churva, the ruins, and everybody thinks it's the ruins because it was destroyed in 48. It was named the ruins because it was destroyed in 1720, not in 1948. But that's Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, born in 1700. Passing away 1700 in Jerusalem. Yes, Alan.
Can you not still see the burn marks on the outside stonework of the Hurban? I thought you could, or is that?
No.
Am I thinking of something else?
You're thinking of something else. The burn marks you see if you go along to the burnt house from it. No, you can't see the burn marks on that there.
Oh, right.
And it was destroyed. It was so destroyed that they rebuilt the whole thing up.
Right. I'm thinking somewhere else then.
If you go through the courtyard and you carry down just before you get to the steps of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, which is the other Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, you get on the left there is the burnt house from the time of the second Beit HaMikdash. That's 1700 years previously from there.
Yes.
There are others, but no, not from that one there. That is the first half of the 18th century, 1700s. Next week, hopefully, please God, we will have the Reform movement, Reb Moses Mendelssohn, and then we will hopefully we'll try and tackle. I'm very apprehensive about the rise of Hasidism, Amisnagdim, and all of that together. It starts, we're getting into home territory, so it's going to be interesting. We will try and navigate our way through it. Jonathan, may I thank you for telling us to continue doing this week.
I'd like to join you in those thanks. It was a super cheer.
So I didn't, when we started at 12:25, I thought this is not going to work. And no, not that the audience. My notes are just that. That's all I've got. Normally I've got pages upon pages. It wasn't there.
You've been preparing the whole day.
It's got there, and I'd just like to thank you, Jonathan, for getting that push along there. I hope you enjoyed it. It is recorded, so we'll send it to David. And Bernice, you can unmute yourself if you want. Sorry, I had to mute you before the noise was coming through from a radio or something or other.
Rabbi, thank you very much. I hope you don't mind if I listen each week. I listen quietly each week and don't.
Bernice, this is open to everyone. It's open to everyone. You get more or less.
Fabulous today. Thank you very much. I look forward to next week.
Same time next week, please, God. Yes.
Thank you very, very much.
You're very, very welcome. All right, I've got to run. Speak to them.
Hour of 7 o'clock. Yes.
Hour of 7. Yeah, I've got to take the kids to school now to pick up their school work so that they can start tomorrow on. Today they had a day off, although they came to a history share, and they're going to take them north to get their schoolwork so that they can go back to school tomorrow.
They won't
online
be on next week.
Rabbi, is there any chance that have you got those magazines from Baylor?
Yes.